Hello, and welcome to DE Classified, a podcast showcasing the history of destroyer escorts. Each month, a member of USS Slater's education crew will highlight a specific destroyer escort and share the stories of the sailors who served aboard these trim but deadly ships.
This podcast is published by the educational team of the USS Slater, DE 766. But this podcast isn't about the Slater. It's about a similar type of ship, the USS PETTIT, DE 253. These two ships are connected by shared experiences of the sailors who served on them, and by the mission of the Destroyer Escort Historical Museum, the organization that runs the USS Slater. While the Pettit and the Slater are different classes of destroyer escorts, they were designed by the same naval architects, Gibbs and Cox. During 1941, Gibbs and Cox built destroyer escorts with a landmark modular design that took into account production bottlenecks that were starting to develop in American shipyards. Ultimately, Gibbs and Cox had 6 basic DE designs that were produced in 17 shipyards. The initial plan called for 1,000 ships, but ultimately there was trimmed back to 563 when the war ended. The DE program started in June 1941. The British government, seeking to take advantage of the U.S. Lend-Lease program, asked the United States to supply an escort vessel that was suitable for anti-submarine warfare in open ocean situations. They needed a lot of these ships, and they needed them as soon as possible, ASAP. The particulars specified a length of 300 feet, a speed of 20 knots, dual-purpose main armament, the newly developed Hedgehog anti-submarine weapon, radar and sonar, and an open-style bridge. Both the Slater and the Pettit met these requirements. Naval aviator Robert Lee Pettit is the namesake of the USS Pettit, DE 253. He was born in November 1906 in Clare, Michigan. He enlisted in the United States Navy in 1927 at the age of 20. After 10 years of service, he attained the rank of radioman first class. In 1941, he was a crew member of a PBY Catalina flying boat attached to Patrol Wing 10. Pat Wing 10 was in service in the Philippines. On December 27, 1941, Pettit died during a bombing attack on a Japanese landing at Jolo Harbor in the Philippines. There were 7 destroyer escorts named for PBY aviators who flew that day. He was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross. The citation noted that he remained bravely at his post in the burning, gasoline-flooded radio compartment of his Catalina flying boat. He was 35 years old. The Pettit was an Edsall-Class destroyer escort. The class was known as the FMR type, which was based on their Fairbanks-Moss reduction-geared diesel drive. This engine is a 2-stroke opposed piston type. It was developed in the 1930s, and it was used extensively in the U.S. diesel-electric submarines of the day. In the 1990s, the engine was still being used for backup power on U.S. nuclear submarines. The Pettit had a maximum speed of 21 knots, about 24 miles an hour. At a cruising speed of 12 knots, the range was over 9,000 miles. The crew was officially listed as 8 officers and 201 enlisted men. The armament was officially listed as 3 3-inch 50 caliber guns, 1 twin 40 millimeter Bofors, 8 20 millimeter Oerlikons, 3 21-inch torpedo tubes, 1 Hedgehog projector, 8 K-gun depth charge projectors, and 2 depth charge racks. At some point this changed. By 1945, the pattern of warfare shifted from surface action to air action. For many DEs, the torpedo tubes were removed and additional anti-aircraft guns were added. By the end of the war, the Pettit had a quad 40mm Bofors mount, replacing its twin mount. The entire Edsall-Class, all 85 ships, were built in Texas, either at Consolidated Steel Corporation in Orange, Texas, or at the Brown Shipbuilding Company in Houston. That's where the Pettit was built. 81 days after laying her keel, the USS Pettit was launched on 28 April 1943. R.L. Pettit's wife, Esther, was the sponsor. On September 23, 1943, the ship was commissioned with Lieutenant Commander William B. Ellis, United States Coast Guard, in command. She was manned entirely by Coast Guard personnel. Faced with the shortage of escort ships, in October 1941, the Navy requested that all Coast Guard cutters be transferred to its control. Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau argued that turning over these ships would result in administrative chaos. The Navy didn't like that answer. Later that same day, Roosevelt signed an order transferring the entire Coast Guard to the Navy. With the change, the order to paint the gleaming white cutter hulls with regulation Navy haze gray happened shortly. However, the cutters continued to be manned by the Coast Guard, in Navy slang term, coasties. During World War II, the Coast Guard would man 30 destroyer escorts, organized in 5 escort divisions. By the way, Pettit's first captain, William B. Ellis, was born in Albany, Georgia. He attended the Coast Guard Academy and was commissioned as an ensign in 1936. He was 29 years old when he took command of the Pettit. After World War II, he remained in the Coast Guard and attained the rank of Rear Admiral. In September, the Pettit held her shakedown cruise to Bermuda. Shakedowns are basically test drives between the Navy and the shipyard. After that, she reported to Com Deslant for active duty. That's Navy speak for Commander Destroyers Atlantic. Initially, she operated under the Fleet Operational Training Command in Norfolk, Virginia. From October to November, she was involved with training exercises, typically in Chesapeake Bay. After training, she was assigned to Destroyer Escort Division 20, Navy reference Corps Dev 20. In the company with Corps Dev 20 on December 12, 1943 through 3rd of January 1944, they escorted convoy UGS-27 en route to various African and Mediterranean ports. The operation was classed as uneventful. Convoy codes are 2 to 3 letters followed by a sequential number. The UGS convoys were a series of slow, eastbound transatlantic convoys from the United States through Gibraltar, carrying food, ammunition, and military hardware to the United States Army in North Africa and Southern Europe. A typical screen was provided by an escort division of at least 6 destroyer escorts. Most of the UGS convoys were given air coverage from either aircraft carriers, small escort carriers, or from patrol bombers flying from the Azores. UGS-27 was a big convoy, had 115 merchants covered by 22 escorts. The final destination was Egypt. From February 1944 until February 1945, the Pettit was largely engaged in escort convoy operations with Corps Dev 20. They typically escorted CU convoys, CU 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 46, and 52. General note on CU convoys. CU convoys were fast transatlantic convoys. Most CU convoys were assembled in New York City and included fast freighters, tankers, and troop ships. Since a convoy can only move as fast as the slowest ship, all CU ships were expected to maintain 14-plus knots. Destroyer escorts provided anti-submarine screens for CUs because many British convoy escorts, like the Flower-class corvettes, were not fast enough. Speed was important. Underwater U-boats had a top speed of 6 knots, and they had trouble maneuvering into attack position against ships traveling at 14 knots plus. Until 1942, because of underwater speed limitations, U-boats preferred coordinated night attacks on the surface, wolfpack attacks. Radar-equipped DEs in large numbers made nighttime surface attacks very difficult. From February 1944, only 3 ships were torpedoed in CU convoys. This was a small percentage of the 2,353 merchant ships that traveled in those convoys. When we watch a football game, the focus is on team action. We typically don't focus on a single player. Likewise, focusing on a convoy instead of a single destroyer escort is an important and different way to narrate a DE classified episode. Convoy operations and the teamwork of destroyer screens is best told from the perspective of the coach. CU-15 is one eastbound convoy. USS Pettit is one of the team players. And Com Corps Div 20, Commander, Destroyer Escort Division 20, Captain Roundtree is the coach. Here's some play-by-play highlights of CU-15. Com Corps Div 20 War Diary, 22nd February 1944. Vessels began unmooring at 0600. 0711, Marchand underway in company with Corps Div 20, standing out of New York Harbor on various courses and speeds, escorting convoy CU-15 from New York City to the United Kingdom. Task Group 21.9, Organization Captain John Roundtree, U.S. Coast Guard. Task Group Commander in Marchand, DE-249, accompanied by Hurst, DE-250, Camp, DE-251, Crow, DE-252, Pettit, DE-253, and Rickards, DE-254. CU-15 Day 1, 322 nautical miles, average speed 13.4 knots. Present 21 convoy vessels and 6 escorts. During the day, Convoy Commodore reported a very sick Navy man aboard SS Fort Niagara. Lieutenant J.G. R.J. Bryant, Corps Dev 20 medical officer, advised treatment. CU-15 Day 2, 358 nautical miles. Average speed 14.9 knots. Present 21 convoy vessels and 6 escorts. During the day, Chief Boatswain's Mate in Marchand sustained fracture and lacerations of right arm above elbow when caught in watertight weather door during heavy weather. Marchand reported number 4 life net carried away and lost. Port Hedgehog ammunition ready box carried away from moorings and damaged during the night. Ammunition recovered and restored. Experienced northwest gales force 6 to 9 and heavy seas, conditions 6 through 8 throughout the day. CU Day 3, 248 nautical miles, average speed 11.5 knots. Present 21 convoy vessels and 6 escorts. Gale force winds continued. CU-15 Day 4, 283 nautical miles, average speed 11.7 knots. Present 21 convoy vessels, but 2 are seriously damaged and 6 escorts. At approximately 21:20 hours, Panamanian freighter SS El Costón in Station 53 had a steering casualty, turned on 2 red lights, but there is no evidence that they gave any sound signal. At 21:25, SS El Costón rammed American tanker SS Murfreesboro on the port side immediately forward of the center island. Murfreesboro immediately burst into flames. El Costón was also covered with flaming gasoline. Destroyer Escort Rickards was directed to investigate for possible sub and then to stand by and rescue survivors. Camp was directed to screen starboard quarter of the convoy. Destroyer escorts Pettit, Hurst, and Crow were detailed to the forward screen. Marchand proceeded to the vicinity of the flaming wreck to look for survivors. 21:57, Marchand was rammed by El Costón on starboard side. El Costón was maneuvering erratically in the vicinity of burning gasoline, but this fact was not discovered in time to avert the collision. Marchand suffered damaged hull and way of compartment B2. Starboard engine was rendered ineffective by the reduction gear being thrown out of line. Marchand's maximum speed was reduced to 12 knots, and it was unable to overtake the convoy. El Costón requested Marchand to stand by her as she was flooded forward in fires in 4 holds, but she would fight the fires if Marchand would stand by. Rickards began picking up survivors. Weather throughout the night was bad, with moderate west-northwest gale, heavy seas, and occasional rain. Convoy CU-15 proceeded onward. Commander P.V. Maver in camp in temporary command of the escort group. CU-15, Day 5, traveled 283 nautical miles at an average speed of 11.7 knots. Present in CU-15 were 19 convoy vessels and 4 escorts. They reported that a concentration of enemy submarines on a course of the convoy caused them to divert to the northward. While CU-15 proceeded northward, Marchand Rickards, SS El Costón, and the abandoned SS Murfreesboro were detached from the convoy. Marchand continued screening SS El Costón, which stood to the leeward, trying to bring flooding and fires under control. At 07:30, El Costón reported that the fires had been extinguished and that the number 1 hold, loaded with ammunition, was flooded. They also noted that the master, 1 mate, and 18 men had jumped overboard. Rickards reported the rescue of 4. Rickards also reported the rescue of 30 survivors from Murfreesboro. Lost from the Murfreesboro were 26 crew members and 17 U.S. Navy sailors in the Armed Guard Unit. At 9:45, Rickards sent a boarding party to the SS Murfreesboro to investigate its condition. The boarding party was unable to extinguish fires which were still burning in the central island. At 12:45, the boarding party returned. The Rickards then commenced transferring Murfreesboro survivors and El Costón survivors to Marchand. Concord Dev 20 staff transferred from the Marchand to the Rickards. The transfer was completed at 14:15. At 14:45, Marchand departed with the El Costón, and they were proceeding slowly to Bermuda at 8 knots. Several days later, it was noted that the El Costón sank. Meanwhile, the Rickards proceeded at 18.3 knots northward to rejoin convoy CU-15. Note on the SS Murfreesboro, the USS Choctaw AT-70, an ocean-going tug, was dispatched from Bermuda. The tug, after a series of difficulties in high seas, managed to secure a line to the tanker and eventually towed her to safety. The trip took 24 days. They traveled 950 nautical miles at an average speed of less than 2 knots. The Murfreesboro still had 4.5 million gallons of avgas on board when they landed. Before she burst into flames, the Murfreesboro was loaded with 5.5 million gallons of avgas. This amount of avgas, by the way, is enough to fly over 3,000 B-17 sorties. CU-15, Day 6. Only traveled 130 nautical miles, average speed 5.4 knots. Present 15 convoy vessels, but there were 4 stragglers and 4 escorts. Detached is Commander Cordev 20 in the USS Ricketts, traveling at a speed of 12 knots in heavy seas, trying to rejoin CU-15. At 14:30, they established communications with the camp and attained position of the convoy. At 22:40, they passed a merchant vessel, which was straggling from a different convoy, XH-280. At 23:25, they finally rejoined convoy CU-15. CU-15, Day 7, only traveled 114 nautical miles, average speed 4.75 knots. 15 convoys present, 4 stragglers, and 5 escorts. At 0700, February 29th, the 4 lagging vessels were as far as 12 miles stern. Moderate to fresh northeast gales, still rough seas, but the weather was improving. The stragglers were the SS Empire Artemis, the SS Cedar Mills, the SS Martin Bake, and the SS Fort Niagara. At 1100, Pettit was sent astern to search for the stragglers. Particular concern was the SS Artemis, which had over 1,400 troops on board. At 2200, Pettit rejoined the screen, having located the SS Martin Bake and the SS Cedar Mills, and had given them directions for rejoining the convoy. CU-15, Day 8. Distance traveled 311 nautical miles, average speed 12.9 knots. Present 15 convoy vessels, still 4 stragglers, and 5 escorts. Received information that the SS Empire Artemis had joined a different convoy, HX-280. Later the day, the SS Martin Bake and the SS Cedar Mills rejoined the convoy. SS Fort Niagara was the only straggler. CU-15, Day 9, traveled 320 nautical miles, average speed 13.3 knots. Present 17 convoy vessels, 1 straggler, and 5 escorts. At 0200, Hearst reported an unidentified Huff Duff bearing. At 2120, Hearst reported an unidentified Huff Duff bearing. At 2217, Camp and Crow both reported Huff Duff bearings. At 2335, Hearst reported an Huff Duff bearing. As the day closed, SS Fort Niagara remained the only straggler. CU-15, Day 10. Distance traveled 237 nautical miles at 9.9 knots. Present 17 convoy vessels, 1 straggler, and 5 escorts. At 0115, Hearst reported a radar contact at 15 miles, proved to be a friendly aircraft. At 1345, another radar contact was challenged, and it also proved to be a friendly aircraft. 1805, received notification that the Fort Niagara was going to proceed independently via the originally designated Stragglers route. Note, the SS Fort Niagara is also a T2 tanker. CU-15 Day 11 traveled 337 nautical miles, average speed 14 knots. Present, 17 convoy vessels and 5 escorts. 2,200 escorts began using Patrol Plan 4A, FTP-215, air coverage provided by British Sunderlands throughout the day and by Lee Wellingtons at night. CU-15 Day 12 traveled 251 nautical miles, average speed 10.5 knots. Present, 17 convoy vessels and 5 escorts. 1914 relieved as escort of convoy CU-15 by HMS Vedette. 2315 Cordev 20 Les Marchand anchored off of Moville, Ireland. The next CU convoy, number 16, had already left New York on March 1st. While escorting CU-16 on March 9th, the USS Leopold was torpedoed. The official report noted, the submarine which torpedoed the Leopold is believed to have been the one reported patrolling line extending from 50 degrees north to 60 degrees north, approximate longitude 25 degrees. On March the 1st through the 9th, a submarine had also been reported as having patrolling vicinity of 59 degrees north, 30 degrees west. It might possibly have been this one. Note, on March the 3rd, noon, CU-15 was already 56 degrees north and longitude 27 degrees west. It was about 130 miles south from the position of the Leopold sinking. They had reported numerous huffed-up reports. The complete story on the Leopold can be heard on the Slater's Destroyer Escort classified page. This will end the story about CU-15. They traveled over 3,200 miles in 12 days. This will also end the first volume of the DE classified file on the USS Pettit. In Volume 2, we'll give you a seaman's perspective on destroyer escort duties in the North Atlantic. And after V-E Day, DE-253 transferred to the Pacific Theater. And after VJ Day, there was an extended search of the South Pacific for missing in action servicemen. We'll conclude with the Pettit's connection to the Destroyer Escort Historic Foundation, the USS Slater Museum. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to DE Classified. This podcast is brought to you by the Destroyer Escort Historical Museum aboard USS Slater. You can find a transcript of this episode, accompanying photos, and a bibliography at ussslater.org/DE Classified. And I hope you'll join us next month when we DE Classify another Destroyer Escort.